You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Land. This podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts Tiffany Cruikshank and Katya Bach as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. Hello and welcome back to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. Today, returning guest Valerie Knopik PhD is here to talk to us about a recent paper which hypothesized that interoception could be the mechanism through which yoga and other mindfulness practices help us manage persistent pain. As you'll hear in our conversation, though, our favorite takeaways are much larger in scope about how interoception is a trainable skill, one with many different inroads for different people, and how it seems to help us with mental and emotional pain as well as physical, whether we know it or not. You'll remember that Valerie is an endowed professor and department head of human development and family studies at Purdue University. With a PhD in psychology and postdoctoral training in psychiatric and genetic epidemiology, Valerie is active in mental health research, focusing on how our internal biology and our external environment, including yoga and mindfulness practices, can interact to positively change our mental health landscape. Let's hear what Valerie has to share today. Hey, Valerie, welcome back to the Yoga Medicine Podcast, and thank you again for making time for us.
I always make time for you, Rachel, and for the Yoga Medicine Podcast. Happy
Yay!
to be here.
I'm happy that you're here today because we are talking about a specific paper from, I think, 2023, which you sent me in advance and I got lost in multiple times. And this is why we have you, a PhD, here to help make some of the takeaways more simple, or maybe not, as we were discussing before I hit record.
Yeah, this was a bit of a slog to get through. I think that there are some good takeaways here, but it was very easy to get into the weeds in this paper if you allowed yourself to get into the weeds. They use a lot of acronyms, and I had to rely a lot on the table, like footnotes, to remind myself about what some of those acronyms were, because they aren't things that I usually use in my daily life. So if you choose to read the paper, just know that it's long and it's a bit dense, but I think that there are some good takeaways, as there tend to be. But this was a bit of a slog for me to get through as well.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to say because so much of the information that we get these days is packaged into kind of like, our diet, into these highly processed, ultra processed foods. Our information kind of comes to us too in these ultra processed bites. And
Yes.
You never quite know all of the background in detail, or at least it's very hard to express that in a 10-second or 15-second social media clip. And that's why having longer conversations is, I think, really important to kind of draw out what do we actually know versus what do we not actually know yet. And, chances are with research, we can't run away with really clear, simple takeaways the way that we'd like to. There's usually more research needed, more work to be done.
Yes. Very few research projects can say, like, without doubt or with 100% accuracy that this is a causal thing, right? They're usually looking at correlations and usually saying, but more research needs to be done.
Yeah. So let's start off with the paper is by Voss et al. And it's Mind-Body Practices, Interoception and Pain, a scoping review of behavioral and neural correlates.
Yes.
So if that title doesn't get you excited, let me give you the headline. We're not going to talk so much about the pain side, although I will link in the show notes to some of our previous pain science podcasts. For those of you who are really interested in the pain side, we're going to lean a little more heavily into the interoception side. So maybe we start with you giving us a brief overview of what the paper set out to do.
Yeah,
and
sure.
We'll take it from there.
Sure. Yeah. So the reason why I chose this paper, and I guess if it's okay, I can say this too. As yoga medicine online teachers, sometimes we're asked to do a monthly dose, and sometimes that monthly dose can can be lots of different types of topics. And I've been really interested in interoception as a practice. I think it's something that speaks to our yoga community, and that we naturally tend to do as yoga teachers in some way, shape, or form for our, kind of guiding our students through the practice. And by nature, I feel like yoga and meditation and those type mindfulness based practices are just that. They're really geared towards the practice of interoception. Whether we're good at it or not is it's just like building a muscle. Um, but I set out to find a paper that was tied to interoception that was recent, because I think we've talked about this before in various contexts, that there's not a lot of really robust, great designs of research that focus on yoga and mindfulness based practices. It's growing. It's a growing field, but historically there hasn't been a lot. And I liked this paper because it tried to present the state of the field, if you will, in this area. And that was the whole intention. A scoping review is to really just determine what's out there and determine if there's any consistent message in order to provide some evidence base that this might be a worthwhile thing to study.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we all can agree, or many of us can agree, that when we practice yoga, we tend to feel good. It makes us feel good in some way, shape, or form. And it has
You heard
been.
it here first, folks.
You heard it here first.
Our first major takeaway from today: when we practice yoga, it feels good.
Yes. Something that I'm sure none of you have ever thought of before. No, kidding.
No,
Kidding.
let's start on really certain ground and go from there. I totally see where you're coming from. Yes, when we practice, we tend to feel better, right?
We tend to feel better. And there has been some evidence to suggest that, a yoga practice or a very specific set of yoga postures can be beneficial for pain, reducing pain. And so what these authors, I think, really tried to do is, let's figure out the state of the field, but also, can we start to hone in on what the actual mechanism is? Like, why does yoga or mindfulness based practices, meditation, things like that, why do they have this effect of pain reduction? And so what they chose to look at was interoception as this potential mechanism. And they measured interoception several different ways. And they also tried to dig a little deeper into what the possible brain or neural correlates are to this pathway of yoga-based practices or mindfulness-based practices and reduction in pain, interoception as a mediator, if you will, like a thing on the path that actually makes a difference. And then is it because of some brain mechanism or neural correlate that is actually also tied to interoception and pain?
And it makes sense for anyone, I think, who's spent much time looking at pain science, because interoception is something that they talk about a lot. As your instinct, I think, would be, if you're in pain, to try to block the pain out or ignore it. But what pain science tells us is getting curious about the pain and its nature and its intensity and its location and its quality actually reduces your perceived level of discomfort. And so I think anyone who's thought much about pain science would be thinking interoception has got to be one of the mechanisms, because it seems to be such a helpful tool for people managing pain.
Yeah. And so, these authors set out to do this, and there are some big limitations in this paper, and I think that they're pretty forthright around what the limitations are. I don't, again, it was so easy to get into the weeds. I don't necessarily want to get into the weeds here, but, none of these studies that they summarize had interoception as a main variable in the study design. It was something that the authors or the researchers who designed the study had it in there as a measure that they were, or a variable that they were measuring. But I think it's important to note as you're reading or listening to what we talk about today that none of these studies that the researchers, that the authors of this paper summarize or consider really had interoception as a main variable. And
And that could
that's
simply be because there's so little research in this field that there's just not enough for people to be looking at a whole host of different topics, including interoception. There just
true.
wasn't much to choose from, let alone probably any that focused purely on interoception.
Yeah. Or it could have been, who knows? It could be for so many reasons. It may be
Hmm.
that they couldn't get grant funded to actually look at interoception, and so they
Hmm.
wove it in a larger study that was funded that aligned with better with the mission of the funding agency,
Hmm.
right? So there could be any number of reasons as to why interoception wasn't a main target variable or outcome, but I think the authors did a pretty good job of finding a host of studies that actually included it and included measures of different aspects of pain. They looked at a lot of different types of pain, which again limits our ability to actually say anything
It
conclusively.
it does, but also when we look at it from the context of somebody practicing yoga or teaching yoga, it covers pretty close to every kind of pain you
It
might
does.
experience, from chronic neck pain to fibromyalgia to knee osteoarthritis to chronic musculoskeletal pain, migraine. There were some studies specific to breast cancer survivors, like a pretty big bucket of different pain types, which is tough for research takeaways, but useful for the general population who are
100%.
likely to be practicing yoga or other mindfulness practices with one of those types of pain.
Yeah, for sure. And then they also had a lot of different interventions that
Yes.
include yoga, but they also included Tai Chi and self-compassion training and mindfulness-based stress reduction and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, to name a few, literally
Hmm.
to name a few of the many that they included.
So again, the opposite of the social media post of do these three poses to fix your pain. Yeah,
Yes.
nowhere near that simple or straightforward.
No, not that simple or straightforward. And it probably isn't going to be surprising that really of this scoping review, they basically were like, yeah, there's been a small amount of research done in this area. And yes, there seems to be evidence that interoception is potentially a mechanism and there should be more research in this area.
Hmm.
Um, and that's potentially not surprising, but I think, I don't know, I still find value in it, even if it was a little bit challenging to get through.
So when we step aside from their primary aim of, we know that yoga and other mindfulness practices seem to help with pain. We'd like to know how. We think maybe interoception is part of the how, and we look more deeply into interoception itself, how they defined it. I found this section quite interesting because when I teach, I'm definitely trying to encourage interoception, but I definitely do it in a very broad sense. Like, you know, follow your breath into your body. Notice where you can feel your breath moving. Notice texture and temperature against your skin, or whether your belly feels full or empty. These are really broad suggestions, whereas they broke interoception down into some pretty specific categories. So, do you want to talk a little about how they defined interoception?
They did. They did. They talked about interoceptive accuracy, which is the ability to detect bodily signals such as your heartbeat, which, well, we can talk about that in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Interoceptive sensibility, which I think is more about what you were just talking about, Rachel,
Mm-hmm.
where it's the subjective report on body states, such as muscle tension, to notice if a particular muscle is feeling tense or relaxed, for example. They also looked at interoceptive awareness, which is both the awareness of and confidence in the accuracy of one's perception of internal states. And then they asked about an emotional evaluation of interoceptive signals. So it's the interpretation of and attention paid to bodily signals. So, and then they looked
Already a
at,
heap more detail than I
I
have
know.
ever thought about going into when it comes to interoception. Because I think, generally, how do I feel on the inside? Sweet. There's my interoceptive practice done. But this is obviously much more detailed than that.
Yes. Yes. And then they also looked at some, as I mentioned, neural correlates. And so, how did they measure those things? Things like functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI, EEG. Um, so, they're actually trying to get a sense of what's happening in the brain in particular tasks. So, they did some pain evoked neural activity. They looked at structural and connectivity differences. They looked at structural differences, um, emotion evoked neural activity. So just trying to understand, like, okay, so we think an interoception might be a thing. There are ways in which we can actually ask somebody, hey, are you able to hear your heartbeat, or, or are you able to understand, think about muscle tension, or how confident are you in your ability to actually understand and listen to and perceive your internal states, versus we're going to see if the brain lights up when we actually give them a task in the scanner. Now, we can have a whole other philosophical debate about whether or not being in a scanner and
It's going
being
to change
asked
things.
to do an activity in there is the same brain response as it would be, if I'm getting up off the couch and I experience pain in my low back or something like that.
Hmm.
But I think it still is instructive and informative in terms of like what parts of the brain might be involved.
And at the end of the day, these are the tools we have.
That's
Until
right.
we can magically sense somebody's internal state, these are the tools we have to work with. So it's
Yeah.
better than just throwing up your hands and going, well, I guess we'll never know. Yeah. Using the tools we've got. But you're quite right. As you were explaining that, I was already feeling my stress levels rise. I'm imagining I've been asked about my internal state, and then they're like, okay, we're going to hook you up and see how accurate you were. And I'm thinking, probably not very accurate at all. So I imagine there probably are some changes. And this, in a nutshell, is why it's hard to study something as ephemeral as yoga, because there's such a subtlety to it. There's such a subjectivity to it. It's very difficult to pin down with really clear cut criteria and measurement tools, right?
It really is. And if you think about, even if you give a group of yoga teachers who are out in their communities delivering like a specific sequence, for example,
Hmm.
those yoga teachers are each going to teach it in a different way or say different things. Even if you give them a script,
Hmm.
they might emphasize things differently. And I think that this is one of the real challenges with trying to do research in the yoga space, is that there's just a lot of individual variations across teachers. And even when we try to make it really consistent, or um, work to make consistent delivery, it's just, even if I were teaching everyone, even if
Yeah.
you were teaching everyone and you had 8 individual sessions and you're teaching the same sequence, you might say the same thing, but emphasize something different, have a different
And
inflection
even
point.
if I taught all 8 sessions at exactly the same time, in exactly the
Yes,
same way, they would still be interpreted in different ways by different individuals based on their
100%.
history, experience,
Yes.
expectations. And I do think I'm okay with that. This kind of
Yeah.
the alchemy of time and space and the chemistry of people coming together, that is to me what makes yoga magical and interesting. But it means that we're probably going to have to accept some limitations on researching yoga forever, because there's so much of it that I don't even want to pin down, really.
Always. And I think, and that's the case with any kind of human subjects research.
Hmm.
The reality of is that humans are messy. It's not ethical for us to control their environments or control this or that like we can with other types of designs. And so um, we're always going to have that messiness that we have to think about and just accept with human research, no matter what you study. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter what you study, because again, I could ask the same semi-structured interview to 100 different families, and each of those individuals is going to interpret it potentially differently. And so you just hope, and but I think we all recognize that.
what did you see as being the interesting takeaways that kind of teased or piqued your interest?
I and this is probably just because of who I am and the types of things that I do for a living. I was very keen on the to notice or to learn about the parts of the brain that were lighting up, and many of them are kind of tied to what you might call the salience network in the brain, which is just a group of regions. Again, it's not super specific, but a group of regions that are responsible for identifying and prioritizing and interpreting stimuli. So when I think about things like somebody's appraisal of a stressful situation, the salience network is going to play a role, and that plays a role in how we respond to a stressful situation. If we think that we have the resources available to manage that stressful event or not, can have a big impact on how our body responds.
That's something I remember you going into quite a bit in the mental health and wellness training of we
Yeah.
think of stress as such a simple clear cut thing, but it's so varied by individuals based on how do we perceive the situation, how do we perceive our capacity to respond to the situation, and what tools we think we have at our disposal. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's really key. It can be such an important it that complexity. I don't even know how. I mean, it's one of the things that I teach about when I teach a class. I think I also taught about it when I was teaching the mental health and wellness training with Diane and Tiffany. Is just our cognitive appraisal of a situation plays a really big role.
Like
And it's
literally how we perceive the situation determines what the situation is, basically. Our perception
yes,
is our reality.
yes.
Yeah.
And I often use the example of like getting a flat tire. If you get a flat tire and you have the resources to get that car towed and to a place where you can afford to buy a new tire, it's maybe a small annoyance. It may have disrupted your day, but it's on the grand scheme of things, it's relatively small. But if you shift your perspective and think about someone who lives in their car and their car is their home, their transportation to and from work, um, a flat tire is a completely different problem. And they not only might not allow them to get to and from work, they also might not have the resources to replace that tire easily.
Mm,
And so it can have a completely different set of consequences depending on whether or not you have the resources available to actually manage that stress. And so
mhm.
I think that was one of the big things that I took away from this, is that too is that there's a cognitive aspect to all of this. And that makes sense to me because I think of interoception as it's a it's something we feel, but for me, I have to think about it in order to get in my body to feel it. Does that make sense? I mean,
I
you and I
mean,
were
that's our
chatting about
job as
this. You
from the
know,
yoga teacher perspective. If it were just easy for people to know how they felt and to respond accordingly, I'd be out of a job. That's pretty much what I'm doing all day is getting
yes,
people into a state where they can safely notice how they feel and make good choices. That's my job.
yes, yes, and if we can become more attuned to better cueing or different ways to help people, because that's the beautiful thing about humans too, there's so much individual variability and differences, and a cue that you might say to one person might completely resonate, but saying that same exact cue to another person might not. And so how can we just think about creative ways that we can help our students tap into this practice, and also to help them just embrace the fact that it's a practice, and
Hmm.
it just takes that repetitiveness, that continued practice. Like you're going to the gym and you're building, I always think of Tiffany like it's the same thing as building a bicep, like you have to continue to go to the gym and lift weights if you want to get your bicep bigger. You have to continue to sit down and try to meditate if you want to get better at meditating, or think about, can you feel your heartbeat? You need to do that every single time, every day, it will just be something that is a little bit more, I don't know, routine for you to do, and just
And I guess
part of.
the
Yeah.
other side of the equation that I always love to point out when I'm teaching is it's really appropriate here in this place while you've got an hour or however long set aside to spend this time going, where do I feel my weight exactly in my foot? And if I lean just a tiny bit to the left, how does that change things? It's not appropriate to spend that level of attention on interoception out in the world. Imagine if you're trying to drive your car, or buy groceries or work with all of that attention diverted elsewhere. It's unrealistic and it's inefficient. So it's I guess it's a really important skill, but it's not one that we have to be practicing 24/7. Just like you can't be
Of
doing
course.
bicep curls 24/7, gym bros.
Yeah.
Here's your second big takeaway. You can't be doing bicep curls everywhere. There's a time and a place for it. And the more honed the skill is, the easier it is to tap into that information when you need it. But, this is why people who are stoned aren't that helpful out in the real world 24/7, because you can't always have that level of, wow, man, look at my hand. Look at how miraculous this hand is. You've got other stuff to do. You've got things to get through. So it has its time and its place. And I do think this is important because when we're teaching and we're teaching people this skill and how amazing it is, and as you said, we need reminding every time, it's also important to remind people that, hey, there's a reason why you're not doing this 24/7 out in the real world, and that's because you've got other things to do.
True.
But
Yes.
if you can, you're having a heated conversation with your child or your partner, and you can spare just a percentage of your brain power to go, wow, I can really feel my temperature increasing, my blood pressure
Yeah.
increasing. I can feel my responses increasing in emotion. Could I just take a moment, take a breath, and down regulate that reaction somewhat to give me a better chance to manage this conversation in a way that's effective? You can tap into that skill when it becomes more honed as you need it, even in the busyness of the day.
100%.
Mm,
So, yeah, I think that while the article was more tied to interoception and its role in our pain management or pain response, I think it has a lot of connections to our stress response,
yeah,
our emotional responses, the
yeah,
things that we do every single day. You get annoyed with somebody who cuts you off when you're driving to and from the store. Um, and I think the more that we recognize our our physiological, our internal responses, the more that we can say, wait a minute, I'm going to take a step back and just pause before I blurt out something that I don't mean, or, act in a fit of rage, have some kind of physical outburst because I'm so angry. I think that those tools are just so valuable for us to
hmm
be better people in the world and in our
yeah. I
communities.
100% agree. As I was reading through, it's pretty focused on physical pain, but I was seeing all of the takeaways to mental pain and emotional pain as well. And I mean, if that doesn't just describe the human experience, I don't know what does.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else did you see as a really interesting takeaway? We talked about um, the the mental side of it, the structures of the brain that you could see getting involved and lighting up. What else did you find really interesting?
Um, I'm looking. And you sent me notes, and I have my own notes. So I'm looking over here, and there's a lot of notes, as you might imagine, because of just the complexity of the paper. Um, I did think it was interesting that, if I'm remembering correctly, that yoga or like these movement based practices seem to help individuals with their pain response, or their management of pain, or how they think about pain or feel about their pain, um, whether or not they've been given some kind of specific strategy or not,
I love
if
this
that
one as
makes
well.
sense.
I love
Okay.
this one as well because the bit that I took away from it was there's one type of kind of pain management where when you feel the pain flare up, here's what I want you to do. I want you to focus on your exhalations or count to 5 or, get quiet and tune into where the pain is. That's a taught strategy. But yoga and mindfulness practices seem to help people whether they had a taught strategy or not. So it's like people were just instinctively getting better at figuring out their own ways to manage and mitigate their pain. And I found that really heartening because, again, as I said earlier, that's kind of my job, is to send people out into the world better able to know themselves and to manage their own reactions and to kind of just move through the world in a slightly more compassionate way. And I found it heartening that it seemed to help whether they knew that that's what they were doing or not. It's like we're giving them a secret mission, and whether or not they choose to accept it, they kind of are. Being better at knowing themselves and managing their reactions.
Yeah, it's happening no matter what, right? Like,
right?
It makes
whether they know it or not.
Yeah, it makes me think of this was years ago. I had a student who would come to my classes, and he was a commercial real estate agent, and would show up right 2 seconds before class started and come in and have his phone on his mat, and maybe even would be doing like push-ups as we're settling into shavasana.
Everybody knows this student.
But he kept coming, and I just kept thinking to myself, I'm frustrated, in that he can't seem to separate, he can't seem to leave the phone in the cubby or whatever, or that he's doing extra push-ups as people are literally laying back into shavasana and breathing really heavy, and to have conversations with him about that separately. But he still was getting something out of the practice that was helping him. And even if I often felt like my instructions or my cues to quiet the mind, or whatever, were just going over his head or going in one ear or out the other, I still think he kept coming back because something there, we were chipping away at something. And maybe it didn't look like what the ideal thing I thought I wanted it to look like or something. It wasn't a quick, oh, I'm now a yogi and I'm going to like go put my stuff aside and just come in and be here 20 minutes early and, whatever. I think you know what I'm trying to say. I think it ties into this idea that like we're helping individuals be better users of this gift of a body that we have been given, and a more informed user, inhabitant. And that's the message is going to get in there differently for different people. But it's almost, it's like you said, it's encouraging. It's not like a one strategy fits all type of thing. Somehow through the yoga practice, somebody's going to really latch on to the physical part of the practice. Others are going to latch on to or resonate more with the more mindfulness part of the practice or the spiritual side of the practice. And all three of those things can be avenues into being more aware in your body. And I think that was a really lovely takeaway for me. And it's going to look different for everybody, but it still is beneficial for everybody. Hence, coming back to like one of the first things we said, big key takeaway of this: when we do yoga, we feel better.
I do love that, because it's like the flip side of my thought process of I'm giving my students a secret mission to be better people to themselves and the world, whether they choose to accept it or not. And this is the flip side of, we agonize as yoga teachers so much about trying to do a good job and trying to give people tools that are helpful. And sometimes it's really demoralizing when it doesn't look like they're taking in the information that we want to give them. If we can just trust the yoga, just trust the process.
They're actively resisting it.
Right? If we can just trust that the magic it's not us or what we're offering knowingly, it's coming through us. If we can just trust that process, that people are getting what they need, it takes a lot of the pressure off. Like, yes, still show up and do your best as a teacher, but just trust that they're getting what they need if they're coming back.
Yeah. Yeah. And everyone's going to be different. I
Hmm.
mean, you and I were just chatting before you hit record about how you teach and guiding students to feel particular muscle or their breath or the temperature in the room. And I often will end the class asking students to, put their hand on their heart to feel their heartbeat, and just putting, actually physically using that tactile placement of a hand can also help our students become aware of what's happening on the inside, where and so, I don't know, I just think that there are so many different ways that we can encourage our students to practice interoception, and it's not a one cue fits all kind of thing. Sometimes it's going to take a few different ways for it actually to resonate with the student, and it might resonate for 2.5 seconds and then not again for the rest of the class, till the
Yes.
next time. So I don't know.
I love that. I love that reminder that we can make it more simple. We don't have to say something challenging like, can you feel your heart beating? We can
Yeah.
say, bring your hand to your heart, bring your hand to your chest. Can you feel your
Yeah.
heartbeat pounding against your hand? We could even have them do something that gets their heart rate up, like some, handstand bounces or some quick sun salutations, and then say, bring your hand to your chest. Can you feel your breath moving? Can you feel your heart beating? We can make it easier for them to make those links between what they're perceiving in their mind and the mystery that exists inside the skin. And
Yeah.
yeah, for us as yoga teachers to try and maybe branch out a little bit and think of some ways that we haven't cued it before. That might be
Yeah.
the breakthrough moment for that one student who is waiting for something that made sense to them.
Sure. Yeah. And maybe it's not even, I don't know. I was just thinking of a class that I taught yesterday. You were there,
I
actually.
was there.
And just like even something as simple as asking students to kind of step off the four corners of the mat and move
Color outside the lines,
color
people.
outside the lines is yet another way for somebody to kind of understand where they are in space.
Hmm.
Are they having an internal reaction because, oh my gosh, I don't step off my mat in yoga. What does this mean? I've certainly been. I'll never forget. I was in a class with Tiffany, and she had us all roll up our mats and then do a practice without a mat for like a few flows.
I'm out. I hate it already.
It's like, whoa, I'm really having to step out of my comfort zone here because I'm so used to this anchor of my mat in this practice. And that is something also that I think so many people love. Like they have
Hmm.
this safe
The
little
safe
island.
space.
And then what happens if I ask you to take that away and practice just, oh my gosh, on the bare floor?
Yeah. And I mean, I do think the way that we often teach at yoga medicine, and your class yesterday was a great example of, most of it is familiar, most of it are known shapes and poses, but you might take a hand outside the mat, a block outside the mat, you take a familiar shape and you tilt it a little bit. And that might be enough to have somebody have a new experience of what it's like to be in their body, just by simply taking away the thoughts of my foot should be here, my hand should be here, my hip should be here, my chest should be here. Just tilting it ever so slightly could have them have a new experience. And so I guess as we're starting to move toward takeaways, there are infinite ways as yoga teachers that we can guide students deeper into the experience of being in their bodies. And we've talked about physical touch and checking in with some of those internal sensations like heartbeat or breathing. We've talked about feelings of texture or temperature against the skin. We've talked about different pockets of muscle tension. We've talked about some ways to disrupt those signals and then have them check back in, doing something quicker to get the heart rate up, tipping a pose or straying outside the familiar boundaries of the mat to have a new perception of where they are in space. And we could keep going probably for hours
Yeah.
of all of the different ways we could play with internal sensation to give people new interoceptive inputs.
Yes.
Mm.
Agreed.
And they seem to be helpful whether people are doing it with a strategy in mind or not. which
Yes.
is also really reassuring. Seems to be helpful whether they're trying to manage pain, physical, emotional, mental, whether they've just come to feel good, whether they've even come with any intention at all. It seems to be helpful regardless, which is lovely.
It is lovely, and it also speaks to why yoga helps us to feel good and why there's not one teacher who is the only person who's ever made you feel good, right? Like you can get these benefits from a whole host of teachers, and they're each going to guide you in a slightly different way. And of course, we have our, like our favorite teachers or whatever, but I think it is a really lovely takeaway that there's really a place for all kinds of teachers because there are all kinds of students who need those individual teachers to help them find a new way in, a new way
Mm,
in.
I love that. Any anything else? Any other kind of takeaways that you want to leave people with?
I think with all research, just if you're keen on it, I would make sure that you read through the limitations. I think the authors did a really good job of outlining the limits of this work. Um, we obviously need more work. Well, I think we need more work. I'm kind of a science geek, but I also think the message is clear. We're doing something good, right? Yoga helps us feel good. We might have some reason as to why. Interoception might be one aspect of that. I think that there are probably other reasons why yoga also makes us feel good, but interoception is one part of that pathway. And our brain is involved in that. There are going to be parts of our brain that light up as we are practicing these skills of interoception. Um, and that these interoceptive skills are are able to be practiced off the mat and can be so beneficial to be practiced off the mat in our daily lives. And
Mm,
we get into some of that, those types of things in the mental health and wellness training. We talk about emotional responses and stress responses and parts of the brain that are involved. And so it is a really nice overlay to some of the concepts that we do talk about there. But ultimately, it feels like we're in the right place and doing good things, and that feels good, right?
mm.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
and I think that the bit that we
Feels like you're
touched on,
making an impact in a good way.
yeah, and that, as you said, it's a skill that we can train, that we get better and better at, which doesn't mean that every second of your life you are walking around fully aware of your heartbeat and
Yes.
your internal sensations and areas of muscle tension. But it means when you do need to tap into that information, it's so much more accessible. In the heat of the moment or in the busyness of the day, you have that well practiced pathway to, wow, I'm feeling quite stressed right now, or I'm feeling overwhelmed right now, or wow, there's a lot of tension in my body right now. You have access to that information quickly enough that you are able to do something about it. You're able to respond in a much more skillful way. And that's what we would like for all of our
Yes.
students, that we inhabit this miraculous body in a way that's a little bit more discerning and informed.
Yes. And I think one more thing is like it's not only that we become more aware of our of our responses, but we can also become more aware of what we can do to help counteract that response. So whether it's I'm just going to get up and I'm going to leave my office and go for a walk around the block, or I'm going to get up and, you know, move away from my computer or from leave this argument or whatever and just step outside for a moment and get my bearings.
Take a deep breath.
Yeah, I think that there, just understanding not only how you're responding to a stressful situation, but are there things in your toolkit from your yoga practice, your meditation practice that you could then put into action sometimes so quickly, breath or a big sigh or humming or like what do we
Mhm.
know is going to calm us down and and I think that's really valuable too.
I think that's a really powerful place to leave people. By all means, dive into the study if you're a super geek and you want all the details. But there is a
What are you
reason why
saying,
I'm
Rachel?
saying you're a super geek. Be proud. Geeks rule the world. I'm definitely not geeky enough. I had trouble with the study, but the takeaways I think are really potent. And that's exactly why you're here to help me find those takeaways. And that is why at Yoga Medicine, I think we put pretty equal weight on what the research is telling us and also what we experience in our own practice, because our experience is just as valuable as what research tells us in a different way.
Yes.
So we will link to the study for people who do want to dive in and read all the details. Don't tell me if you found it really easy to understand and you didn't get lost. I don't want to hear about how much better you are at it than I am.
I
But we
didn't
will link.
find it easy either. So
Okay. We'll link to the paper and also to the mental health and wellness training, because if you're interested in all of this stuff, how the brain responds to stress, everything, strategies that we can use, all of the different approaches that we can take, then that training dives super deep. We'll also link to your monthly dose that is a more short snippet look at this paper, and your previous episodes on the pod, as well as some episodes on pain science for people who came looking for the more pain science angle. So you're going to have resources galore.
Thanks for
those
taking
super
care
geeks.
of us, Rachel.
You are welcome. And thank you so much for coming and spending your time to take us through the takeaways from this paper. I really appreciated it.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you liked the show, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com. Check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine, or you can email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being part of our Yoga Medicine community. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.